BIS conference. I'm Maria Brindelmeyer. I'm the Secretariat for Building Evidence in Education, or B2, as we are also called. And we're delighted that you're participating in this session today. Today's presentation will tackle a topic that is at the heart of many education programs and systems, like how can governments, funders, and implementers of education programs ensure the best use of scarce investment, and how can we compare different education programs with true costs and make sure that programs are compared equitably. So accurate cost information is obviously at the basis of many of these analyses, and developing standard mechanisms for capturing the costs of education interventions will increase transparency and also allow for the linkage of cost to outcomes and enable value for money analysis. So B2, and I'll talk a little bit about what B2 is in a minute, has collaborated, the members have collaborated to tackle some of these questions. Next. So quickly, what is B2? So B2 is a donor working group that was launched in 2012 with the aim to engage bilateral and multilateral organizations and foundations with the objective to promote the use of evidence in education programming, increase the quality of education research, and strengthen donor research collaboration. And the governance for this group is a steering committee composed of DFID, USAID, the World Bank, and a UN agency, which is currently UNESCO. The activities include in-person and virtual meetings for collaboration and sharing of education research, research mapping, and also discussions in smaller interest groups or smaller working groups on specific topics. So for example, early childhood development or education in conflict and fragile situations, etc. So these are some of the objectives of the group, and the outputs, next please, of the group, among other things, are guidance notes. So we have 4 guidance notes, of which one of them is the focus of today's presentation. The first 2 guidance notes were on generating evidence and assessing the quality of evidence in education. And the more recent ones are qualitative research in education and cost measurement. Next. So for today's session, we have 2 speakers, Dr. Elena Walls and Dr. Alaka Holler. Elena is the Senior Monitoring and Evaluation Advisor in the Bureau for Economic Growth, Education and Environment at USAID. And Dr. Alaka Holler is the Senior Economist for the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund, or SIEF, at the World Bank. And Elena and Alaka are the main authors of this guidance note, and so that's why we are particularly thrilled to have them do the presentation today. So with that, let me hand it over to our speakers. Next.
Thank you, Maria. This is Alaka speaking. And so I just want to start with a very simple question, which is, why is this not my house? I think it's obvious to everyone who has been in the situation of buying a house that you have a budget constraint, and that rules out many houses that you might want to purchase. Next, please. Unfortunately, we don't take this, at least when those of us working on research in low and middle income countries, we often don't take this kind of approach when we are screening interventions that we might want to implement, right? So very rarely, at least on the research side, are we diving deeply into how much interventions cost, which should rule out many interventions that we test in a pilot phase for scaling up. Next, please. So on the research side, we rarely measure costs. Next, please. And when we do it very sloppily, right? So we do some back of the envelope. I wouldn't even dignify it with back of the envelope, maybe back of the napkin kind of estimates. And then we want to kind of use this for decision making. And I think this is a mistake, both the rarity of costs and the methods that we use and don't use to measure costs. Next, please. And this is a bit of a puzzle because budget constraints are real. Next, please. We are taught about these budget constraints in the abstract. So for those of you who have done economics or have done a public policy degree, these books might be familiar to you. And you cannot encounter a problem or a concept in these books without the budget constraint being pretty prominent. And also, when I was working in operations, so when I was not working in research, but I was more client facing, so working with governments and ministries, the first questions they will ask are not about evidence, not about the benefits of something. They quite believe you that there are benefits of whatever intervention you're talking about. But the first two questions they will ask are, how much will this cost? Next, please. And and what do we need to implement this? So what's the total amount of budget I should be requesting, say from the Ministry of Finance, and what is needed to implement this? So who should be implementing it? How much supervision should I put into this? Things like how often am I going to be needing to make budget requests? Are these one-time costs? These are the prominent questions on the minds of people who have to implement this, and not just people who are on the ground implementing it, but people at higher levels who are requesting budgets to implement these interventions. Next, please. And as I mentioned, we do this pretty sloppily when we do it at all. And I want to argue in the next couple of slides that inaccurate cost data is probably worse than no data at all. And I'll start with just a simple numerical example, and then I'll give you a real example. So for the numerical example, let's consider a program that costs about $500 per beneficiary that generates, say, an average net present value of $1,000 in earnings. Okay, so this is a typical way we kind of talk about the returns to education. And so this has a benefit to cost ratio of 2 to 1. So this is like an extremely, extremely high return investment if these costs and benefits are real. Next, please. But let's consider what would happen if your costs, the costs that you measure, were off by more than a factor of 2. Okay, this suddenly goes from being something that has high return to something that just breaks even, or if it's by more than a factor of 2, if your costs are more than a factor of 2, then it doesn't look like a good deal at all. It looks like you are spending more than you're getting back. Next, please. And what if benefits were actually more realistic, right? So a benefit to cost ratio of 2 to 1 is pretty not realistic. I mean, you rarely get something with this kind of benefit to cost ratio. So also, if benefits were more realistic, then this also looks like not a good idea, right? So if we measure costs and it's giving us, and there's mistakes in the way we measure costs, then it's making a bad idea look like a good idea. And this is not helpful for countries, particularly because they are very well aware of their own budget constraints. Next, please. And so now I'm going to give you a real example and show you that it is very possible for costs, if we don't if we don't measure them very carefully, it's very possible for costs to be, our estimate of costs to be off by more than a factor of 2. And so I'll start with this example in Bangladesh, where in the portfolio that I manage of impact evaluations, there was an impact evaluation looking at extending preschool by 1 year. Right, next, please. And so one of the questions was, so the question of the impact evaluation is, what is the benefit of adding an extra year of preschool? And so the parallel of that for cost would be, what is the cost of adding an extra year of preschool? And we thought this was a very good case study. And in fact, it has all the attributes that you would think that would be helpful to getting any kind of measurement right? So it's implemented by Save the Children, which has a very good track record of implementing and monitoring programs. It was piloted in government schools, right? So that much of the infrastructure was already there, and there were known costs for that infrastructure. There was an accompanying impact evaluation, so things we knew the benefits were going to be measured pretty carefully and pretty accurately, and that we'd be able to attribute the benefits to the actual intervention. And there were high impacts at midline, and from the monitoring data, we saw that the program was well implemented. Okay, so this has all the hallmarks of something working out in terms of measuring costs. Next, please. But when we first looked at the financial record, so we came in when this program had already been implemented for 1 year, and we asked them, can we see your financial records? Will that give us a good sense of what the costs of running this program have been for 1 year? Next, please. But when we asked them, we got a very, very aggregate budget. And I think, and I'm just, this is not the actual table they sent us, but it's very similar. And I think this will be familiar to you, those of you who have worked with implementers in the field. When you ask for financials, you typically get something that's very, very aggregated, and with broad categories like materials and monitoring visits and salaries, and you have no idea what lies behind that. Is that, for example, for primary teacher salaries, is that, how many teachers is that for? Does that include the head teachers? And where in this list do we see supervision? Because we know programs don't happen on their own. So this is what we got from this very well implemented program. We got this kind of financial record. Next, please. And when we just dug into it a little bit, some of these costs that were in this aggregate budget that was sent to us ended up not even being costs of the intervention we were interested in. So, the actual implementer in Bangladesh implementing this did not actually have program-specific budgets. They had an early childhood education budget. And so when we asked for a program-specific budget, that was not how they were keeping their financial records. And so when they quickly gave this to us, and then when we investigated, some of these costs ended up not even being part of the intervention. Next, please. Okay. And so then we decided to collect costs in real time for the next year of the program. And we used the ingredients approach that's often used in education. And we decided to do it in real time so that we could try to maximize accuracy. And so we collected the data in real time. We collected it from multiple sources, not just the financial records of Save the Children, but we did interviews. We asked people to report on their time allocations. And we also kept in mind all contributors. So this program had some public investment in that the program was implemented in public primary schools, but it also ended up having a lot of community investment. So we made sure that we were trying to get all contributors. And the reason we're trying to do this is data that is disaggregated and intervention specific is going to give us accurate data on the intervention that we are trying to cost. And when we did this, next please. This is what we found. So I'm going to take you through these bars and to show you how our estimates of costs changed throughout this process. So if you take a look at estimate 1, this white bar, which is around $27,000, this is the cost of the program that we would have estimated if we solely relied on the financial records that the implementer was keeping. Okay, so then we had to, as I said, we had to take out the items, the ingredients that were not at all part of this intervention, so obviously that took the cost down. And then this is kind of a process. So we're working with the implementer, trying to get them to do as much of this as possible. And then, for estimate 3, we said, the materials costs that you put in there is not realistic. Like, we know you're not spending, I think they had something, it ended up being something like $5 per school. We know that's not realistic. Do you have a materials list, for example, that we could cost out? And then in that step, they gave us a materials list and we costed it out and we got an absurd estimate. And then we probed and they said, oh yeah, all schools don't have all materials with the quantities that we specified. And so if you go to estimate 4, right, which is the 131K estimate, this is the estimate we got just working with them and trying to get them to articulate what are all the ingredients, including the labor and supervision and everything that goes into implementing their program that they had been implementing for 1 year. And when we did that, we got this 131K estimate. And then, they had not been collecting data on time and effort and things like that. So again, after the first few months of program implementation, we had a second estimate, kind of a pre-intervention estimate. And then finally, throughout that year, we had them collecting real-time data. And so finally, we could see the real expenditures given the categories we were asking them to collect data on. And at the end of the year, our estimate of that 1 year of implementation was 157,000. Okay, and so I just want you to compare 157,000 to 27,000. Okay, so that's off by more than a factor of 5. And this is pretty typical, not the factor of 5, but definitely off by being off by more than a factor of 2 is pretty typical when you compare financial records maintained by the program implementer and the estimates of cost that you get when you use a more careful, disaggregated approach to measuring costs. Next, please. Okay, and so then to conclude, I just want to take you through, again, for the same program in Bangladesh, these different estimates of cost that we got. So if you look at the first row, and then let's just focus on the last column, the rightmost column, which is usually the way the unit costs, usually the way costs are presented. So based on our totally disaggregated real-time data collection, we got a cost of around $145 per kid. Then I want to take you through some estimates that you might also see in the literature, just to compare how they differ. Okay, and so just to caveat that $145 unit cost, we did sensitivity analyses, which is, again, best practice to do when measuring costs, because these are just estimates. And with our sensitivity analysis, we have a range going from about $100 to $250. And then I want to take you through these last 3 rows, because these last 3 rows is when we do see estimates of costs and research. This is what we see typically. Okay, we see sometimes people estimating only the programmatic costs. So what we mean by that is they exclude things like overhead and management and supervision. Okay, and if we only did that, we would get a very different estimate. We would get something like $81 per kid, which appears very, very cheap. I mean, $145 per kid is still pretty cheap, but this is much cheaper. Okay, and if we only looked at the costs incurred by the program implementer, right? So not the communities, not costs that we can kind of attribute to the government, since we're using their facilities. We have also a different cost. We have a cost of $110 per kid. And then finally, some people only look at the costs that are financial costs of the frontline delivery, right? And that looks really, really low in this case. It's $43. Next, please. So these first three columns, right? So these higher costs that take the full economic costs of implementing the program. So the opportunity costs, the social costs, all of this, that is $145 per kid. And that, which for donors and for governments, this is the cost that we need to know, right? So this is the true cost of implementing that program. Next, please. If you look at this row that says programmatic costs only, this is a cost that I think mid-management of Save the Children might want to know. But this is not the costs that we should be comparing to benefits when we're analyzing this program. Next, please. And then the next estimate, like what are Save the Children's financial costs? This is something that the financial team of SAVE should be interested in. Again, not people who are estimating the cost of this program to society and to compare this cost to the benefit to society of this program. And then finally, next please. This bottom row, which is the lowest estimate of costs of this program, the only person who should be interested in this cost is the program manager of the intervention. This is the person who is responsible for hiring workers and running the program, within the village, for example. That's the only person who should be interested in this estimate. Unfortunately, these bottom lower estimates are what we typically see when we do see costs in research, in education programs in low and middle income countries. Unfortunately, it's these bottom three rows of costs that we typically see. And we're, in this guidance note, we're arguing for an approach that allows us to estimate these costs in the first three rows of this table, which is what, these are the costs that as governments and donors and people who are trying to assist governments and donors make good programming decisions, these are the costs that we should be interested in. Next, and I think it's Elena's turn.
Thank you, Alaka. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
So Alaka did a terrific job to outline the magnitude of the problem that we have when it comes to cost estimates. So what is the solution? Before we dive into the cost measurement approach that we propose in the guidance, I just wanted to take a minute to talk about the definition of cost, because I think this is sort of that fundamental concept that underlines the guidance note. And I know Alaka already alluded to it, so I just wanted to bring us all on the same page with this. In the guidance, we define cost as the totality of incurred monetary expenditure and in-kind contributions that resulted in a given education output or outcome. And this is important because it basically means that cost is not just the expenditure that's the activity tracks or the project tracks, but it also includes other components that perhaps are less visible, such as, the time of the volunteers, the in-kind contributions of the governments, the schools that the program perhaps is using that it did not build or is not paying for. And it's really important for us to account for those costs as well when we think holistically about measuring cost. Next slide, please. So in the guidance note, we use a framework depicted in this slide for cost measurement. This framework illustrates how the objectives of cost measurement inform what cost data must be captured, which in turn determines what types of cost data analyses might be best suited for the purpose and type of data. The relationship between analysis and objectives is bidirectional. since through reporting, we need to ensure that the cost-related learning questions identified at the onset are answered. Next slide, please. The objectives of cost measurement establish the foundation for what cost data should be collected, how this data should be analyzed and reported, and finally, what type of education investment decisions this data can and should influence. If, for example, the goal of cost measurement is to identify the most cost-effective approach for achieving an education-related goal, then more than one program must be costed. If, however, the costing exercise is informing a future scale-up of an intervention, then detailed data on units, quantities, and prices must be collected, and fixed costs related to program setup must be separated from more variable costs related to implementation. Next slide, please. One of the most important elements of the cost measurement is real-time cost data collection. Just like Alaka explained in her example, what difference it makes when we actually capture cost data during the program implementation. Differently from other approaches that rely on budgets and retrospective analysis, we emphasize the importance of real-time cost data capture, and this visual outlines the entire life cycle of cost measurement. Any project always starts with some kind of policy objective or development challenge, which will drive the project objectives. For instance, if you're implementing an activity designed to improve livelihoods among disadvantaged youth, but you're not sure if your intervention should just focus on narrowly defined livelihoods intervention, or you should supplement it with literacy and numeracy skills just to lay the foundation for young people's future, you can design the activity to try out both models and set up tracking costs as well as results of each model. So in the end, you not only would know which model is more effective for long-term outcomes, but also which one is more cost-effective. The essential point here is that asking questions early and thinking what we would want to know throughout the activity, throughout the project, and at the end of the project is really essential. Next slide, please. The guidance outlines the main types of costing analyses and identifies what questions they can help answer, what data each of them will require, and how the resulting estimates can be used in decision-making. We focus on 4 types of analyses: cost economy, cost efficiency, cost effectiveness, and cost-benefit analysis. While these types of economic evaluations have been around for decades, and some, such as cost utility analysis, are not even included here, the BE2 framework builds on the 4E value for money framework that was put forth by DFID back in 2011, and which is already very familiar to many development funders and implementers. This framework identifies the types of analysis which tend to be most useful for informing policy decisions around education programs. And it also clarifies what type of policy question the different types of analysis are best suited to answer. So let me give you some examples here. Cost economy analysis can help us answer what it costs to deliver the program, how much was spent on different activities, how much was spent to develop versus to implement the program, and perhaps with the sufficient data, how much should the government budget for scale up if we were to transfer it to the government for implementation. Cost efficiency analysis help us understand what did program cost per output delivered. Like for instance, in Alaka's example, when we look at the program delivery cost per child, how does that compare to other delivery methods for this output if we have another program that's costed out that has similar objectives? Finally, cost effectiveness analysis helps us understand what the program cost per outcome delivered. And again, you saw that metric in Alaka's example when she was talking about $144 per improvement in 0.26 of standard deviation on the metric measured on the outcome sought. It's really important to emphasize that both cost efficiency and cost effectiveness are inherently comparison measures and best interpreted in the context of comparing different types of intervention to aim to achieve this similar developmental objective with similar populations. Finally, cost-benefit analysis helps us understand how the cost of the program compared to the monetary value of the benefits created. And in this type of analysis, we need to be able to list out all the benefits we anticipate and be able to assign monetary value based on some pre-existing data. Next slide, please. We have to make sure that the data on outputs and outcomes is also comparable. A coordination on key output and outcome indicators across donor agencies is really important to accomplish this objective. In the recent years, the international education community came together to develop common metrics under the leadership of UIS to operationalize sustainable development goal indicators. For example, in basic education, the indicator 411 is proportion of children and young people, A in grades 2-3, B at the end of primary, and C at the end of lower secondary, achieving at least a minimum proficiency level in reading and mathematics, disaggregated by sex. The international community has come together to establish the global proficiency standards and benchmarking methods to support comparable measurements of this indicator. And that's really important because fundamentally this guidance is supposed to help us use data and assessments from various donor organizations to pull together for learning and to be able to compare different results of different studies. Another important element is comparability of methodological approaches in measurement. BE2 produced a guidance on impact evaluations and on assessing strength of evidence to help establish common standards and common definitions in research and evaluation. Both of these guidance notes are really useful in setting groundwork for common definitions and common approaches. Next slide, please. The guidance, now I'm going to talk about specific approach that we recommend for measuring cost. We recommend activity-based costing approach for cost capture step of cost measurement. This approach is based on activities, which are any event, unit of work, or task with a specific goal, such as conducting teacher training, or developing or producing books or other learning materials, engaging in policy reform, or undertaking a learning assessment. The activity-based costing approach lends itself really well to international education development, since the number of education-related tasks is not large and is fairly universal across countries and education systems. Which activities should be costed will depend on policy interests and learning objectives that the national government or the donor is seeking to answer. Activity-based costing approach requires establishing clear, unambiguous categories of tasks that will be used to categorize costs. There may be different ways to categorize education costs. Under the UN's classification of the functions of government, for example, the education sector includes broad categories of expenditure based on the education subsectors, from pre-primary to primary to tertiary, and includes categories for research and other functions. These broad categories are useful for an overall understanding of the level of investments at each education level, but they do not help us understand the effect targeted interventions or system tweaks may have on student achievement, as well as other outcomes of interest at a given level of education in a specific country. For example, a donor might support primary grade teacher training. It will tell us the overall level of input increase at the category of primary education, but it does not tell us where the investment was made and what results we are to expect. To achieve objectives outlined in a guidance note, the donor community, partners, as well as national governments need to have more granular data on the cost of components of the education system in any level identified in the UN classification. So for instance, if you recall Alaka's slide when she was talking early on what we need to know, everybody wants to know the cost and what's needed to implement. And this is exactly what we feel is needed to support governments with the improvement of education systems. So the level of detail about how the investment was used and what the results were is necessary for learning what works in education development and what types of interventions seem to produce better results. Detailed data on cost as well as results of donor-funded interventions is also a prerequisite for successful scale and sustainment of effective interventions by host governments. An additional categorization of activities common to every education system can help achieve these objectives. Our guidance puts forth new activity-based categories for cost measurement that include typical inputs in the education sector, such as pre-service and in-service educator training, development and production of teaching and learning materials, strengthening government education systems, private sector engagement, among others. Please refer to the guidance note for the complete list with detailed definitions for each category. Examine alongside common education system performance indicators, such as categorization of expenditure within each UN education sector level, will allow us to achieve a better understanding of how resources are being allocated to improve system performance. Policymakers and donors will be able to use longitudinal data on donor investment and system response to more accurately assess the value of their investments and compare levels and trends across projects and country contexts. Such data will inform country education planning and help donors as well as governments prioritize further investments. Finally, our cost capture approach involves not only direct monetary contributions, but also in-kind contributions, as I mentioned in our definition of cost. Capturing estimates of major contributions in an intervention from other sources includes estimates of host government contributions, as well as estimates of non-government, corporate, and individual contributions such as donations by corporations of technology, which frequently happen, volunteer labor of parents, of community members. All of those need to be captured to better understand the implementation and its cost. Estimates can be derived from a variety of sources, including verbal and written communication, documentation and written communication by various representatives of NGOs, host government, private entities, as well as implementing partners. We recommend that only contributions be captured that are essential for program implementation and that otherwise would have to be purchased. Next slide, please. So bringing back that notion of value for money, fundamentally, cost measurement aims to provide information for more informed decision-making within budget constraints. When examining value for money of different investments, the intention is to improve our understanding of cost drivers in different contexts and what can be done to improve value for money of any investment. We do not believe that there can be a universal formula for determining value for money. It is fundamentally a comparative, not absolute concept, and best applied when comparing different solutions for addressing a development challenge. These comparisons can be made in the context of a specific development objective when we examine alternative solutions. Fundamentally, what we want to achieve is the most public good with the amount of resources we have in addressing a specific development challenge. Next slide, please. To finish this presentation, just a few notes about the guidance. It was developed by USAID with input from the World Bank, IRC, and DFID, and it builds on experience with collecting and analyzing education cost data over the past decade. To reiterate, the main objective of the guidance is to help harmonize cost measurement approaches across donors and organizations. It is not designed as a detailed methodological guidance, nor as a guidance for reporting process. Those would need to be established within each individual organization. Instead, it is attempting to build a common mindset and language which underlines the existing methods or process efforts. We also conclude the guidance with providing recommendations for how to establish cost measurement within each interested organization, and always happy to engage with anyone and help you support with establishing such processes. So that's all from me. We can now move to discussion. Next slide.
All right. Thank you, Elena and Alaka. That was a really clear presentation on what it takes to analyze it and capture it, and why we're actually doing all of that. So thank you very much. You can either type your questions into the chat box, or since we are a small group, I will unmute everybody now. So if you have any background noise, please mute yourself, and please just unmute yourself if you want to speak and if you have any questions. And to get us started off, let me ask a question. So Elena, I know you've had some experience also based on the similar guidance that USAID has rolled out. What have you seen the biggest challenges that implementers or others have had when they have tried to apply these cost guidance?
Well, the major challenge is actually finding time to try to understand the necessary shift, because what we're proposing in our guidance, both in USAID's guidance and in BE2 guidance, is really not that complicated. It's not rocket science. We're just saying that, look, let's see where the money goes and try to understand what results we get for this money, and being very clear about it, right? So that is just simply different from the traditional approach of capturing data for the entirety of the intervention, no matter how many, or the entirety of a project, I should say, no matter how many different components it may have. And while it looks like a big lift, it is actually not. Once relevant stakeholders take time to understand the approach and try to apply it to their project, they find that it's actually not that complicated, and it can give them information that is useful, not just to the donor, but also to implementing parties as well. Over.
And Alaka, from the World Bank's experience, any additional thoughts?
Alaka, you muted.
Sorry. Yeah, this is a challenge, what Elena just mentioned in World Bank projects, because typically they are large reforms that the government is implementing, and that is kind of the unit that is tracked, like the whole project. And to further complicate this, when something is implemented by the government, rather than say like an NGO partner, it just, the idea of allocating costs and shared costs just becomes very relevant. So for example, many of the government entities or staff that are working to implement, say, a project, they're also working on 3 other projects. So allocating their time and costing their time for the particular intervention that you are interested in becomes a challenge, because that is not something, their time allocation is not something that's usually tracked and doesn't have a separate budget for the different projects that they're working on. So that becomes quite difficult. The other thing that is typically difficult to cost, I think, in both types of program, NGO implemented programs, but also government programs, but I think it's just order of magnitude more difficult in government programs, is this cost of supervision and management. Again, the people who are doing that typically are paid from a totally different budget from the budget of the program. They tend to be civil service workers that have a salary that's coming from a regular place, and that will not show up in any program records. And for many programs, you know, it's surprising when you actually do cost them out. Those supervision costs, the admin costs, the overhead costs are quite sizable. Like, you know, a third of the costs or more. And so if you ignore those costs, you're going to be off by quite a bit when you estimate the costs of a program.
Great, thank you, Elena. Alaka and Elena. May I just kind of call on Matt? Matt, you mentioned something early on that you had started to implement some cost programs, cost evaluation, I believe. could you tell us perhaps a little bit on, from your experience, what you found the most challenging? Oh, well, let me just unmute you. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that the most challenging part is just getting the inputs from the implementers in a way that is usable and that makes sense without completely recreating financial records that often have been incurred over the last 2 years or more. That is the most immediate, concrete challenge that we've faced. I would add to that in a similar way, getting a consistent methodology for determining costs, like opportunity costs, that aren't very neatly accounted for in any way. You know, the really clear example is volunteer time. If volunteers are not paid, but they are incurring a cost to support a program, how do we factor that into our costing? It comes down to a lot of judgment at some point, which is very hard to assign value to.
Yeah, I think Matt, what you just raised, the issue you just raised, relates to something that Fabiana has just raised in the chat room, which is she's asked. I wonder if you could share some of the promising practices on promoting the role of beneficiaries, like school communities, and cost analysis exercises. So I think this is a challenge, and so typically when I've seen these costs measured, so volunteer time or contributions that communities make, particularly for schools, like for not just for community schools where it's obvious they're paying the teacher's salary and for inputs, but even for public schools, oftentimes parents are helping the teacher out. The only way I've seen this, when it does get measured, the only way I've seen it being measured is typically through the surveys that are happening within an impact evaluation. So when you are making the investment of going door to door and surveying people, either for your midline survey or your endline survey, you make sure you ask questions to elicit this kind of volunteer time or community contributions. And similarly, you might want to do a survey of whoever else might be contributing. For example, if the service providers are volunteers, you would have to do a survey for them to be able to report on this, because again, none of this information is ever captured in any kind of routine monitoring and evaluation. I mean, households are not typically part of monitoring and evaluation, and either are service providers in terms of their reporting their time. So far, the only way I've seen this actually happen is through surveys. I'm not saying that's the best way, but that when it does happen, it happens through that way.
Mm-hmm. At USAID, we are trying to institutionalize routine capture of such data through our cost measurement additional templates that we have that's specifically designed to capture details of the intervention. And Matt, you can check it out on the cost measurement website that I shared in the chat, and the templates that we use for that purpose, both to capture the contributions as well as improve our understanding of the overall program, like overall intervention, how it is supposed to be done, what sort of dosage it delivers, things like that, theory of change. So I also must add, you must love our real-time data collection visual, because I agree with you, that is the challenge. If you come in at the end and try to cost out something that has already occurred, that is indeed an incredibly difficult proposition. And as Alaka example showed us, also frequently can be inaccurate. So I think capturing cost data in real time is definitely the right way to go here. Over.
Thank you both. Can I also call perhaps an Agan? I may be not pronouncing this correctly, but I believe you're active in Kosovo. And just to see kind of what experiences have you had, or what would you expect to do with the guidance that we just explained? So again, we have unmuted you.
Okay, I don't know if you hear me.
Yes, we hear you. Thank you.
Yeah. My name is Agon Dula. I work for Austrian Development Agency in Kosovo. We are a project for education, aligning education and training with labor market needs. I am coordinator for vocational education and training and private sector, cooperation between vet and private sector. And I found this the cost estimation very interesting because we are just ongoing with one activity which is related to financing formula for vet, especially for vet system in Kosovo, because it's really complicated and they have tried several times to find a way how to address this issue, but we are now trying to coordinate with all the donors and try to do something regarding this aspect. We have selected a company which are experts on, and they are evaluating the situation. We have had like 3 or 4 working groups, and we will have several others to see the different perspectives, the perspectives from school directors, perspectives from municipal education directors, from municipal economic directors in all municipalities that we deal with, and also from the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Education, etc., because we are doing this as support for Ministry of Education mainly. And we are trying to see where's the problem that even though there are money spent on vet system, still there is no the success that we wanted, that we would like to have. And this is because we don't have proper, for example, school directors, they don't measure, they don't have the exact cost per student, how much it costs for their profile, for example, or for their sector. Right now it's evaluated like 23 euros per person, per student, per pupil in average. But as we know, it's completely different. Other high school students and gymnasiums, for example, comparing to vet schools, because they have a completely different treatment. They have equipment and machineries, and they need to do practical work, etc. That's why we are trying to develop a formula that will also be supported by school directors who would do the evaluation of costs per student. And this would help a lot also when we do the planification of budget in terms of central government or local government, how they support them. And I saw that several slides were really important and really helpful to get a grasp. And I will share this also with our working group if it's possible.
Yes.
Because I know that this is being recorded, and let's see what we can get from this very thoughtful discussion.
Thank you, Agan. That's really helpful. And yes, so we are recording the session. We will share the recordings. I have my email at the end of this so that you can just send me an email and I will send you the information. And we will also share the cost guidance notes, the cost guidance kind of publication with you that is at the basis of this. So everybody who is interested, just wait for the last slide. We have my email on it, and we can also put it in the chat. And then
that
Elena,
would be really helpful.
Yes, great. And Elena and Alaka, any thoughts regarding what Agan just shared with us?
Alka, do you have suggestions?
No, just that I think it's worth doing a costing exercise. Particularly, he mentioned there's a lot of heterogeneity across different programs, different types of training. This has come up in another costing exercise that we were participating. It's totally different sector. It was on community-based schools in Afghanistan. But again, you saw this variation. There's totally different costs if you are a community-based school delivering secondary education services versus a community-based school delivering early grade primary school services. But at least in the past, there was just one budget given to all types of schools. And when we actually examined expenditures as much as we could, because it was a retrospective analysis in this disaggregated way, we saw, as you would expect, totally different costs across the different types of schools. And some of them had no relation to the just universal budget, the universal per school budget set by the government. And so I do think that introducing this idea that different programs will have different cost structures, and actually having the data to show that will be very helpful for the next budgeting process, because having this just average cost in mind that every program should have, X amount per student is not at all useful. And I think having a careful exercise that actually justifies why there would be different unit costs across programs will be very helpful for realistic budgeting going forward.
And just to add to that, I remember you saying that the results are also not it is something that you would want to see. So I think, in fact, if the results are not positive, then effectively all this money is wasted, right? So I think that focusing perhaps on what results you want to achieve and figuring out what resources are necessary to accomplish this result, then costing exercise could hopefully help you in that direction, because maybe it is just grossly underfunded. Maybe the allocations are, not really appropriate, and how it's linked to the theory of change, like in terms of what these programs are trying to accomplish. If there is this disconnect that we frequently see between the training and the labor market needs, then starting with labor market needs, with labor market assessment, and then feeding this, enabling those channels of communication with TVETs, this is something that we see actually working pretty good. I would recommend you check out Workforce Connections. So USAID has this website that has great resources for labor market assessments, and to help you also think through those causal pathways between the result that you want and investments that you would be able to make, as kind of underlining foundation for future work. And cost study would be, of course, as Alaka pointed out, a very useful piece of it.
Great, thank you. We have one last question from Nafis. I guess it's more like a comment that you would like to get the recording, and we will also send the slides and the guide. So if you can go to the next slide, Ali, please. So this is my email address. If you send me your email address, and Nafis obviously will capture yours, thank you. Or also if anybody wants to send me their email address privately in the chat, you can do so too. And we'll be happy to share the information. And I know that our speakers and our organization, the B2 network, would be happy to answer questions if there is any that come up as you're trying to implement this. With that, let me thank our great speakers, Elena and Alaka. Thank you for sharing this information. Thank you for having developed the guide. And we really look forward to seeing a lot more cost data over the next few years. I know that everybody will benefit from that, and we will have much more cost-effective and cost-conscious investments. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for joining this session.
Thank you. Thank you,
Maria.
Bye.